Morning. How are you guys? I'm good. Is next week spring break? Well, that's exciting. I forgot I get a week off. All right, so I don't know. Actually, don't know. Did they give you guys a schedule at the beginning of what topics we'd roughly be covering? Okay. Cool. Because we're off schedule, so you don't care. We're just a week or two behind, week and a half kind of behind, partially because of the snow day. So the hope was to wrap up Luke before spring break. That's not going to happen. So today I'm going to go through a lot of the parables in Luke. That's kind of the section of the book we're in. And then next week we'll do some more stories out of Luke. And then right after spring break we will get to look at the crucifixion, resurrection stuff that first week back. And then we're just going to do John, another gospel again, which is a lot different. Cool? All right. So mainly we're going to look at parables. Before we do, just a couple notes. So we're roughly in Luke chapters 10 to 16 today, and not necessarily, pretty much in chronological order, but not necessarily. The point of today is just for you to hear some of these stories that Jesus told. So we spent a lot of time telling the stories about Jesus. Today we're going to look, like we did at the parable of the seeds last time, look at a lot of the different stories that he made up, that he told to try to teach a point. Before doing that, just a comment about the different sorts of people who were hearing Jesus' story. There's a quick little story about Jesus that says he went to the house of Mary and Martha, and they were friends of his, and that he went there to teach. And so what would have been very common in the day of Jesus for a rabbi was for him to teach men. So how that might work if you went to someone's house is the rabbi would come in, would sit down in a particular room or outside, and the men would come around and they would sit, generally just sitting on the ground with the rabbi, and that was often called sitting at his feet. So you would sit at a rabbi's feet, and you would learn. And the rabbi might just teach you some things, tell you some stories like Jesus does. You might be able to interact with him and ask questions. And this was the main way that people learned about God, was sitting next to someone, asking them questions. It was never even really an option or conceived that women would get to sit in the room. The role of the women in the culture would have been to serve the men, and they might have been in the kitchen, preparing food or whatever, but they were not to be learning like a disciple with the rabbi. The men, the way it was supposed to work, is the men would teach their women when they were alone with them at home and their children, but not in the presence of the rabbi. Obviously, thankfully, the world's way different today. Not completely, and especially not in some other cultures, but closer to equality. And Jesus is a major reason why, in my opinion, that it is that way today. Why there's men and women here, nobody thinks anything of it. So there's this particular story that if you kind of read between the lines, there's like a big lesson and then an even bigger lesson that's underneath it. So Jesus is at the home of Mary and Martha. He's teaching. And Mary is in the room with Jesus. So she's where she's not supposed to be. She's sitting there learning, sitting at his feet as a disciple. And we will see other stories in which the women are included. Revolutionary, like I can't overstate it enough. This just never happened. Jesus changed everything when he invites women in to hear the stories and to learn. Martha was doing what she thought she was supposed to be doing. Martha was not sitting there with Jesus. Martha was preparing food for Jesus and serving him. And finally, Martha gets so upset in this particular story that she gets frustrated with Jesus, and she says, "Tell my sister to come in here and help me trying to prepare food for you." In essence, she says, "Tell my sister her place is in the kitchen, not out there with the men." And Jesus says, no, he refuses to. He says, Mary has chosen what is better. And so there's two sort of lessons here. The obvious one is to say that even if you didn't know the cultural stuff about men and women, Jesus is clearly saying something about being with him and learning from him, being with him, versus sort of serving him, working for him. And while he doesn't say serving for him or working for him is bad, what he says is being with me is better. And so this is a common teaching with Jesus as it relates personally to him, but also with God. Our first hope, responsibility with God is not to serve him, not to work for him, not to do great things for him, but in essence to be with him, to learn from him, to sit at his feet. Jesus says that is better. In essence, invites Martha in to sit at his feet. And the underlying lesson that I set up before this, of all that, is that anyone can come to Jesus' feet. Anyone can sit with him. Male, female, we'll find out later. Jewish, non-Jewish, free, slave. Anyone is welcome to come and to sit at the feet of Jesus. And those who do are well received by him, because there's a humility that comes with sitting at Jesus' feet. So that story's in this section we're looking at. I wanted to pull that out and juxtapose it or compare it, contrast it to the other sorts of people that would be hearing Jesus teach, which we've already talked about quite a bit, these Pharisees, teachers of the law. So in these sorts of stories where the Pharisees and teachers of the law are hearing Jesus, they don't seem to be his disciples in the sense that they're just sitting there asking questions. It's often in a public place. Jesus will be speaking in public. The Pharisees will be hearing what he's saying, and then they will interact with him, usually in a negative way. And just to recap, when Pharisee, if you hear that word outside of church today, if someone says you're a Pharisee, that has a negative connotation. Again, that's just because of these stories of Jesus. Before Jesus, the word Pharisee in that culture did not have a negative connotation. It meant someone who was trying really, really, really hard to obey all the rules and follow God, and you would think of them like a good pastor, priest, or whatever. But Jesus has quite a beef with them, and they with him. And so their main problem with him is that they feel like he's leading people astray, and they are the spiritual leaders, and their job is to protect the people. That this sort of, con artist, magic worker, hillbilly, unsanctioned rabbi has come in and is leading people astray. Jesus' beef with them is that they built their whole reputation on being super religious, super spiritual, being near perfect, that they spend all of their time and energy spinning that image of perfection. But Jesus can see into their hearts and minds. He can see their thoughts. He knows their desires. And their hearts are far from God, even though their actions act as if they're close to God. And so Jesus will call them hypocrites often, which is another word that has negative connotation today. You generally don't want to be called a hypocrite. It just meant actor. It meant stage actor. I think I've told you this before. So if you actually go watch a play in Jesus' day, you would watch the hypocrites put on a play. And hypocrite meant nothing bad. It just meant people that pretend to be something they're not. And Jesus made it bad in a religious context because he says you're actors. You're pretending. Your hearts are far from God, but you're pretending like you're really close to him. So this one particular story where Jesus sort of goes off on them, it's called the 6 woes, woe to you, which you can interpret it different ways. I tend to think of it as something like, man, I just feel sorry for you. Like, Jesus says to their face, in essence, you're completely a mess. Like, you come at me all like you are superior to me, but in reality, it just makes me feel worse and worse for you every time you come in. So we see with Mary and Martha how Jesus interacts with people that genuinely want to be with God, even those people that are normally excluded. Now he interacts with these people that are the exact opposite. These are the people that are worthy to sit in a room with him. These are the religious leaders of his day. And he says to them things like, woe to you, I feel so sorry for you. And then he gives them analogies. So these are kind of like really short parables. So he says, woe to you, I feel sorry for you, you Pharisees, you teachers of the law. It's a pattern. You Pharisees, you teachers of the law, you actors, you hypocrites. This is what you are. You're a beautiful goblet. On the outside is gold and jewelry, rubies, diamonds, expensive, beautiful golden goblet. And on the inside, you're full of crap. You're full of dung, is what he says, right? So you see this beautiful goblet, you expect it. So even the phrase full of crap we get from Jesus, right? You see this, it looks like it should contain some very expensive wine, or at least a nice Red Bull or something, right? Like, should have something you want to drink in it. And Jesus says, nope, on the inside it's crap. You're a fraud. You're fake. He says, woe to you, you teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you actors. I feel so sorry for you. This is what you are. you're a beautiful tomb, like a coffin, laced in gold, jewels around it. But you know what's on the inside of a tomb is a dead, rotting corpse. On the outside, you look good. On the inside, you're dead. Then he says to them, woe to you, you teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you actors. I feel sorry for you. This is what you do. You tithe. You give 10% of your money to the temple because you're commanded to. That's great. You give 10%. He says you go so far as to give 10% of your dill, mint, and cumin. So the little herbs and spices that they would rate, that they would grow, they were so religious that they would take 10% of their dill plant and bring it and give it to the priest, because 10% of everything belongs to God. They're so legalistic. He says, I feel so sorry for you because you tithe even your spices, but you don't give even 10% of the love and justice that God demands to people who need it. So you're giving 10% of your stuff away, but you're 100% selfish. You do not love the poor, and you do not seek justice. So I feel sorry for you. He said, I feel sorry for you. Woe to you, you teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you actors. This is what you are. You're blind guides. So you are showing people exactly where to go, but you're blind. You don't have any idea where you're going yourself. I feel so sorry for you, you teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you con artists. You take the door to the kingdom of heaven, and you open it up, and you tell people, walk this way. And then when they get in the doorway, you slam it in their face. I feel so sorry for you, you teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you con artists, you actors. So that's part of a nice little speech he gives them straight to their face. And so the tension begins to mount in this story, that Jesus isn't going to be pushed around by these religious guys when their hearts are far from God. He's going to love and accept the Marys and Marthas and the prostitutes and the tax collectors and the lepers and the cripples and all these people who come to him, honestly come to him seeking help. He's going to forgive everything and love them in an instant. But the very religious, the super religious, he's going to tell them to their face what they are. This is the reason, this conflict I'm talking about right now is ultimately why he's killed. Because he's threatening, he's speaking, in those of you that ran last semester, we talked about prophets speak truth to power. This is what he's doing. He's telling truthful things to powerful people. And as a result, he's getting himself in trouble. So after these stories I just told you, there's these series of parables. And let me just buzz through them, tell you the basic parables. Maybe most of them may be self-explanatory, but I'll kind of tell you what they mean. Jesus says this at one point. And a lot of these parables start with someone asking him an honest question. So the question, this is actually just a statement. One of Jesus' followers says, tell my brother to share the estate with me. So this guy comes to Jesus, their father's died, and the brother, probably an older brother, has taken the entire inheritance. And he comes to Jesus and says, tell my brother that he needs to share his money with me. Which is interesting because that is the teaching of Jesus, but evidently what Jesus sees in this guy's heart is greed. And so he says you should be on the lookout for all sorts of greed. Here's the story. There was a wealthy man, and this wealthy man had a banner year. His farm and his crops, he had got more than ever. He had all this food and all this, which represented money because he's a farmer. And he was worried and stressed about it because he had all this extra stuff, and he thought, this is what I'll do. I'll build a huge barn and a bigger house so that I can store all this food in and then sell it, when it's time to sell it and make a lot more money. He builds this, works really hard, builds this huge barn, this big house to store his food in, and that very night when the house and the barn are finished, he dies. And Jesus says, what is better, to work really hard and get riches for yourself, or to give riches to God and to other people? So, simple little story, but the point is this. You can work your tail off, you can make a lot of money, you can be super successful, and at the end of the day, you're going to die. Everybody's going to die. And you may not even get to taste the results of your hard work. You might die even before you get to experience the things you want to experience. So wouldn't it be better to be generous now? Wouldn't it be better to be rich towards God instead of being greedy for yourself? There's a couple analogies. They're barely parables after that. Jesus says, what should I compare the kingdom of heaven to? What's it like? The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all the seeds, but when you plant it in the ground, it becomes this big bush, and it creates a place for the birds of the air to come and to nest, and it gives us, the mustard plant, which we can use for food and all this sort of stuff. But it's a tiny, like if you held a mustard seed in your hand, it looks like an ant. It's a tiny little seed, but it creates this, it's almost a tree. It creates this big plant. And Jesus says that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. So a kingdom of heaven, it just takes a little bit of understanding of what it is, a little bit of putting it into practice. And remember, when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, not talking about the afterlife, he's talking about living with God right now. He's talking about walking out the prayer that we've prayed, our Father in the heavens, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. He's talking about living life in community. When you live that way with God as king, just a little bit, if you do it just a little bit, it will take root and it will grow. But you have to have that seed. And this also ties back to his other parable of having good soil. You have to be ready for that kind of seed. He says, very similar, the kingdom of heaven is like a little yeast that a woman works into dough as she's making the bread. Yeast makes the dough rise. And you just need a little bit. And if you put just a little bit of yeast in, the dough will rise and it will become bread. Otherwise, we're eating pita bread our whole life. Yeast is what makes it, more delicious, fluffy, whatever. And so it's just this little bit of yeast and just this little seed that when it's planted into someone, the kingdom will begin to grow. The next analogy he gives is enter the kingdom through the narrow door, he says, or narrow gate. Matthew says gate. Enter through the narrow gate. For narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few people find it. But broad or wide is the road that leads to death and destruction, and that's easy to follow. A lot of people do that. And so, to me, I think this whole business about the narrow gate and the wide gate is that Jesus is always here to test our thinking. If we just float through life and don't think much about life, don't examine our life, if we just float through, it's like a stream in a river. We're all just sort of going our own way. It has a lot to do with sort of self-preservation and pleasure and doing what we want and getting ours. And so if we float through that, it's like this, he says gate, narrow and wide gate. In this culture, he might have said there's this massive interstate that everybody just goes on. And if you're not thinking about it, it probably makes sense. Just get on 75 and head north or head south. But you won't find life on the highway. There's a small little street. You have to find that small street, and when you find it, then you'll have life. And the reason so many people go through the wide gate is because it's enough for them. They feel like life's okay. And this is a common theme of Jesus, particularly in Luke, that if you're wealthy, if you've got everything you need, if you're wealthy enough if you're just wealthy enough to not worry about having a place to sleep tonight, to not worry about having food, to not worry about being taken care of and protected, if you're that wealthy, it's super easy to just flow through life. Jump in the river and just let it take you wherever it goes. But narrow is the gate, because you have to be super desperate to want to get off the freeway. You have to be super desperate to try a new thing. And it's easy, actually, for very poor people to find that narrow gate because they're looking for something. They're looking for hope. But it's harder for those of you that are already in the stream, already on the freeway, to pull off and to go through the narrow gate. Jesus will say this a dozen different ways through his lifetime. And if there's anything that should give most people in America a cause to concern when you hear the teachings of Jesus, if you think you totally get Jesus and you totally understand everything he said, and you're a good Christian, you're doing the thing, and it feels super easy to just kind of understand it and to do what he says to do, you probably aren't quite there yet. You probably haven't fully unpacked all that he's saying when he says, no, choose the narrow gate. Go through the way that is harder. And on the other side of the narrow gate, you will find this kingdom, this presence of God in a totally different way. There was two stories back to back here. Jesus starts talking about, in essence, how to act at a dinner party. And at first, this just feels like he's giving sort of social lessons, kind of weird. Because why is this rabbi teaching us how to go to a party? But there's two analogies that he's trying to draw out. He's actually speaking to one of the Pharisees. And in Luke, it's a parable, but in one of the other Gospels, it actually sort of happens, and it's told in real time as Jesus goes to a party. Jesus says, suppose you go to a friend's party. You've been invited. It's a dinner party. So don't imagine maybe how we would normally think of parties. Think of something a little more formal, like you're going to have dinner at a friend's house, maybe a politician or a wealthier friend for their birthday or something like that. And there's this long table, and at the head of the table is the important person who invited you to their party. But they also invited 30 other people. And the time comes to choose where you're going to sit at the table. How are you going to decide where you should sit? And the person who invited you is a friend of yours, but he's also super important, very wealthy. Let's say you're friends with the governor, or you're friends with the president. And he invites you over, and there aren't assigned seats, so no one's quite sure where to sit. And obviously, there's some other important people here too, but the person you would love to spend the most time with is the person who invited you to the party, partially because you like them, but also because you can get the most out of them. They can do you favors that nobody else could do. It would be great to have time, an hour, next to them at their right or left. And so Jesus says, so what you might be tempted to do is go and sit next to this important person. Don't ever do that. When you go to a party, never sit next to the most important person. Take the worst seat. Take the seat at the very end of the table. Take the seat at the kids' table at Thanksgiving, right? Get as far away from the important person as you can, because this is what will happen. Your friend will look up and he will see you at the very end of the table. And he will say, what are you doing down there, my friend? I invited you. I wanted to spend time with you. He will look to the person to his right or left and say, trade places with him. I want to talk to my friend. Then that person will be humiliated and you will be exalted. That's the way the kingdom of heaven works. Those who seek to be exalted will be humiliated, and those who are humble will be exalted. Then he goes on. That's the first dinner party rule. He says, here's another thing that might happen. He actually tells a parable here. He says, imagine there was a man who threw this dinner party, wealthy man. And again, he's got 30 seats, and he sends word to all of his friends. Now, this is different than that first story, because all of his friends, for whatever reason, are busy, and they don't want to come to his dinner party. But this guy's it's going to blow it out, right? It's going to be amazing food, live entertainment, wine, the whole deal. And so he invites his friends. He's going to spend a ton of money on them. Come to my party. Maybe it's his birthday. And he sends his servants out. He's so wealthy, he doesn't even, send invites. He personally sends people to go invite them. And the first one says, I would love to come, but I just bought a new house and I got to take care of it. I'll catch the next one. They go out to another one of his friends and say, I'd love to come, but I just bought 5 oxen and I got a new car, or however we would think of it, and I got to take care of them. Another one comes and says, please come to my master's party. And he says, I'd love to, just got married, we're going on our honeymoon. I'll catch the next one. And they can't find anyone to come to the master's party. So the servants go back and they say, my lord, all of your friends are busy. In essence, maybe you should reschedule. Or maybe, for whatever reason, underneath all of this is they're not grateful for what you're offering them. They think they've got something better to do. And the master becomes indignant. He says, no, we're having this party. You go back out and you invite the homeless, invite the cripples, invite the prostitutes, invite those who've never been in my home, invite people that have never had a party like this. This house will be full tomorrow night of people who are grateful for what I'm giving them. And so they go out and they do that. They invite the homeless, they invite the cripples, they invite the prostitutes, and the house is full, and these people have a party like they've never had before. And Jesus, in essence, says this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like this man who throws this party, and he invites those who are close to him to come, referencing the Pharisees. He invites those who know him to come, but they don't want to come. They got it all figured out. So then he invites the outcasts, the prostitutes, and they come, and they experience this great party because they're grateful. From there, then, Jesus tells one of his most famous parables, and it's in the context of these Pharisees again. So, and it's very similar to that banquet. Ultimately, the story is very similar to that banquet parable. He tells three in a row. This is in Luke chapter 15. It's a very famous chapter. So there's these three parables. It's the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. So the first one is the lost sheep. The first two stories are shorter, and the parables are there along with the Pharisees are there along with his other followers, right? And he's frustrated that the Pharisees' hearts are so far from God. He says, suppose there was a man that had 100 sheep, and he watches after them, and one of his sheep gets out. What does he do? Well, he makes sure the other 99 are safe, and then he goes and he looks for that lost sheep. He looks everywhere for it. When he finds it, he grabs it, he puts it on his shoulders, he walks home, and he has a big dinner that night and celebrates with his friends and family because what was lost is found. Have I told you about my dog that runs away all the time yet? No. So I have a beagle and a lab. The lab's awesome. She never runs away. She's perfect. The beagle was free at the pound. We rescued him. Charlie's his name. And he's 8 or 9 years old now. He was free. I had to buy a $3,000 fence, though, to keep him in the yard. So he wasn't really free. Don't let him fool you. So last year, he dug under the fence, like Shawshank Redemption. Like, he's got to get out. Dug all the way under the fence and got out on the other side, and we had to stop everything we were doing. I was watching a West Wing marathon on the 4th of July. It was a good day. And I had to go look for 2 hours with him. I finally found him, brought him home. And then just last week, he did it again. We thought we had fixed the problem. Dug out, snuck out. My wife calls me. I'm at work. I'm an hour away. She's crying. My kids are going to kill us if we lose their dog, yada, yada, yada. So I start to drive home. Ultimately, she leaves everything she's doing. She finds him. I had to walk out of a meeting. It was kind of embarrassing, but my wife's crying, and I actually do love the stupid dog. So I'm in a business meeting trying with this app company, trying to think, I have a real job. This isn't all I do. And I say, you know what? I got to leave this meeting because my dog got away. Like, I got to go. And so ultimately he was found. It's all good. I think I told you a little bit of that last week, but that's this story with the sheep. Now, we are very emotionally attached. If you're a dog person, you love dogs. The sheep to this person probably represented a little bit more money than a lovely little animal. But the point is, everything's safe. I'll tell you this, like, my kids are older now. They're almost your guys' age. They're in high school. But when my kids were little, when my kids were 3 and 5 years old, if the dog escaped and my 3-year-old escaped at the same time, I don't care about the dog at all. I got to go get the 3-year-old. Like, that's way more important. And this is the way Jesus begins to talk about grown-up people. And this is where we get imagery and language in Christianity, like, I was lost. When people say, like, I was lost and then I was saved, right? This sounds like very religious language, but it's being pulled out of parables like this. I was the lost sheep. I was lost. And then my master came and saved me, rescued. He came looking for me, and he rescued me. Okay, that's the lost sheep. The second story is very similar. There's a widow that had 10 silver coins, and this would have been the entire extent of her wealth. This is what was going to keep her alive through the rest of her life, were these valuable 10 coins. She loses one day in her house. Can't find it anywhere. She knows she had 10. She only counts 9. That entire day, she obsessively cleans her house, looking in every nook and cranny. Finally, she finds it somewhere, and she rejoices because what was lost was found. So she lost 10% of her money, would have represented maybe an entire year of her life to stay alive, to eat, and she finds it, and she rejoices. And then in the same vein, lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. Jesus then tells the story of the prodigal son or the lost son. And so he says there were 2 brothers, and both of the brothers lived with their father. And the father, in this culture, so they are grown-ish. I mean, think of like somewhere between 16 and 30 years old, right? They're old enough to work on the farm with dad. The older brother is the good son. He's never thought of leaving his dad. He will never leave his dad. He works hard for his dad. He understands that everything his dad has is his, and he works with his dad on the family farm. The younger brother doesn't feel that way about things. He actually goes to his father one day and he says, "Listen, Father, it's not really fair that I have to wait for you to die to get my share of the inheritance because there's a lot I want to do. Please go ahead and give me my half of all the wealth and give my brother, save the other half for my brother, but I want mine now." This would have been in this world, as Jesus was telling this story, people would have looked at each other like, come on, that doesn't happen. Like that's nobody's going to be that rude, nobody's going to be that callous. Besides, technically, the older brother's supposed to get everything and then decide if he wants to give some to the younger brother. But they're going with it, right? It's just a story Jesus is making up. He's not pretending like it really happened. He's just telling the story. And they say, okay. So the father loves the younger son so much, even though he's hurt, he gives him half of all of his wealth, and the younger son immediately runs off. He runs, it says, to a distant land. It's Vegas. That's where he goes. So he goes off and he parties. Like, that's clearly what it says he does. He eats, he drinks, with prostitutes, and he spends all this money in a matter of months. He blows through it. And then he realizes he doesn't have any money left. He doesn't have a job. He's not home. He's poor suddenly. And all of his friends he had when he had a ton of money are gone. All the girls are gone. All of his buddies are gone. There's no more fun to be had. It's Johnny Manziel all over again. There's no fun to be had. And he's starving, so he has to take a job feeding pigs. And to the Jews, pigs were disgusting. I think I told you that in that one story last week. Pigs were dirty animals. Many Orthodox Jews still don't eat pork. So you would not touch a pig. They're dirty. And here he is in the muck with the pigs, taking care of pigs, something a good Jewish boy should never do, feeding the pigs this sort of rotten food that's left over that's no good for human consumption anymore. And he's so hungry, he starts eating this rotten food that he's feeding the pigs. And it says in the middle of this sort of pigsty, he comes to his senses. He says, "What am I doing? I'm sitting here, I'm eating rotten food with pigs. Well, my father has a mansion. My father has a farm." He says, "This is what I'll do. I'll go home and I'll prepare this speech. I'll say this to my father. My father, I'm not even worthy to call you father anymore. I'm not worthy to be your son. I'm not asking for any money or any favors. But what I realized when I was feeding the pigs is that your slaves have a much better life than I have. Please take me back as a slave, not as your son, and let me live here in your house." So the son decides this is what he's going to do, and he starts the long journey home. It says that the father would sit and watch down the road and wait every day for his son to come home. And that as he sees his son come over the horizon, the father runs to meet his son, would have lifted up his robe and ran. And again, people would have looked at each other as Jesus told the story. Running, even today in many Middle Eastern cultures for grown men, running is something that's seen as very childish. I don't know how to, might be like doing cartwheels or something. Like, they didn't put on their Nikes and go running. For a grown man to run was a symbol of weakness and childishness, but this father doesn't care. He runs to his son. He grabs his son, and as the son looks at his father's eyes, he tries to start his speech. "My father, I'm not worthy to be called your son. Just let me be a slave." And the father doesn't listen to him. He grabs him, he hugs him, he kisses him. He calls for his servants. He orders that the fatted calf be killed. So this was, like the animal they were saving for a big banquet. They didn't know for what, but someday. So he orders this. He orders a huge party to be given for his son. And that night, the son is cleaned up, haircut, new clothes. He's not reinstated as a slave or a servant. He's reinstated as a son, even though he went out and lost half of his father's wealth. And there's this huge party at the father's expense. And the father is the sort of dad that wants his sons to be home, obviously. He loves his kids. He wants them in the room. At the party, he looks around, and his son is there, but his older son's not there, the good one, the one that never left. And so he has to go look for him too. And he goes out and he finds the older son who's pouting. He refuses to go into this party. He says, "Dad, I can't believe you did this to me. You know how I've served you I've worked my tail off for you all these years, and this kid runs off, wastes half of our money, and then you come back without any consequence. You let him have this party. You wouldn't even give me a young goat to have a meal with my friends. And here, you're wasting all this money on this kid. And the father says to the older son, my son, you have everything I have. Everything that is here is yours. But this is your brother. Your brother was lost, and now he's found. Your brother was dead. We thought he was dead, and he's alive. And the story ends there. Whether the Pharisees knew it or not, that entire story was crafted for them. Many of us love this story because we so easily put ourselves in the position of the younger son. As I get older, I can also put myself in the position of the father somewhat easily. So we assume, how many you guys who heard that story before one way or another, right? So this is a story we've heard before. That we assume in hearing that the whole point of it is that all of us are like that younger son, right? We wander away, we do our own thing, we have our years of rebellion in high school or maybe not college, I don't know. We have our years of rebellion where we go and we drink and we party and we sleep around and they're selfish and whatever, and then at some point we're like, what am I doing? This life is miserable, I'm hungover, this is terrible, I don't want to live like this. I'm going to go back home to God and God's going to forgive me. That's how a lot of us contextualize this story. If that is how you contextualize it, good. I'm glad it works for you that way. And that truth is certainly in there. And by the way, if that's you now, come home, right? Great. If that's what it means to you, awesome. That part in this whole story is just kind of implied. That's not the point of this story. When Jesus first tells the story, the point isn't that you bad kids can come home. The point is that the good kid, this is the point, the good kid is a selfish jerk. That's the point of the story. The selfish jerk in the story you would think is the young kid that runs off, but he's not, because he's repentant. He's sorry. He literally repents, turns around, walks home. He comes home with the attitude of, I'd rather be your slave than be a pig farmer. The younger kid are representing all the people in the crowd of Jesus' day, the prostitutes, the tax collectors. The older son represents very good religious people. He even says to his father, I've been perfect my whole life, and you waste your love on this kid? And the story ends with him saying to the older son, don't you get it? This is your brother. And that's exactly what he's been trying to tell the Pharisees. Don't you get it? These are your brothers. These are your sisters. And they would look and they could not comprehend that a prostitute and a tax collector and a leper are their brothers and sisters. Those are the outcasts. They couldn't get it. He says, look, we thought you gave up on these people. You thought they were dead, but look, there they are. They're here. They're alive. They went in the kingdom. It's up to you to humble yourself and to come in. And I think Jesus masterfully ends the story right there. We don't know if that older brother, it ends abruptly. It needs another sentence. It should end one of two ways. It should either end with the older son, the good son, saying, no, I'm not going to your party. This is unfair. Or it should end with him saying, you're right, Father. They are my brothers and sisters. Take me in. Let's go eat. Let's go celebrate. He doesn't do it either way because he's waiting on the Pharisees to decide which way they're going to go with this whole deal. And ultimately they're going to say, no, these are not our brothers and sisters. You're the problem, Jesus. And we're going to, in essence, kill you. And so one more story, because all these are similar in vein. This is a story about a man named Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is an actual person in the Gospel of John. He's the brother of Mary and Martha that we talked about, but in this story is a name that Jesus just gives one of his characters in this story. Lazarus was a homeless man, destitute, and he would sit, he had sores all over him, he was sick, the dogs would come and lick his sores. Jesus says, he paints this terrible picture of this very sad homeless person that would sit outside a rich man's house, and he would beg this rich man for food every day, and the rich man would never give him food. And then one day the rich man dies. And Jesus says that the rich man goes to eternal torment, and he's in this fiery place, being burned alive, like this terrible imagery, right? It's how we might commonly think of hell, a literal hellfire. Jesus rarely actually uses this imagery, but in this story he does. And so, and this man from this place of torment in the afterlife, Lazarus also dies, the homeless man. He looks over, and there's Lazarus on the other side of this chasm, and he's got food, and he has water, and he's with God. And the rich man who's in torment begs God, please send Lazarus over with just a drop of water to put on my tongue. I'm in torment. And God, in essence, says back to the rich man, this chasm is too wide. I couldn't send him back if I wanted to. Besides, Lazarus has a hard life, had a hard life, and now he's getting his just reward. You had an easy life. Now you're getting your just reward. And the man says, well, at least send Lazarus back to tell my 5 brothers what's waiting for them if they don't change their ways. And God says, I'm not going to send Lazarus back. Your brothers already have the law and the prophets. It's all in there. They already have the scriptures. They know how they're supposed to treat the poor. They know how they're supposed to treat those who need justice. One more person coming is not going to change their mind. So that's a really dark story, right? But underneath all of these stories is that the religious elite have ignored the poor among them. And they have ignored those who need justice. And they have actually played into and created an economic and religious system that makes them wealthier and wealthier and the poorer, poorer and poorer. And this is the thing that Jesus won't let go of with them. And he even paints this terrible picture of this eternal torment to say to them, look, you're going to end up in terrible pain if you don't repent and come back. Because the rich will be poor, the poor will be rich, the lost will be found, the found will be lost. The powerful will be powerless, the powerless will end up being powerful. All these, Jesus used all these turns of phrases to say, eventually these people are going to be fine because they're with God. It's your choice. Are you going to be with God or not? All right? We'll close on the nice hell story. So I'll see you guys Wednesday. We'll look at some other stuff. Thanks.